Yep, it's off.
Ooh, let me go back.
Good start.
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. So tonight, I noticed about a week ago Phil had a slot free, and I thought it'd be a good opportunity to talk about enterprise scale landing zones. So any of you who've been involved with the user group for a while now may recall that some time ago I did a CAF session, Cloud Adoption Framework session. So this is kind of building on that somewhat. So we wanted to kind of talk to you a little bit more about enterprise scale landing zones and how that relates to CAF. So we'll certainly talk about that. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Paul Grimley. I'm a cloud solution architect at Microsoft, and I'll let Matt introduce himself.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt White. I'm also a cloud solution architect at Microsoft.
Perfect. So I guess just before we get started, as we get started, a couple of things I just wanted to kind of get your mind thinking about is with your customers that you're working with, or if you are a customer, I guess questions to ask are certain things like, are you lacking agility, consistency, security approval? Are you struggling to scale? Or are you struggling to meet regulatory compliance? I'm not getting better at Matt, and I did that earlier with you as well. Should have practiced that one. So I guess I want these in the back of your mind thinking, okay, if any of these apply to you, then I think enterprise scale is something that you should be listening and learning about, because there's some really good stuff that we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm going to hand over to Matt to run through the next slide.
Thanks, Paul. So in the past, when customers have said to us, how should we build our landing zones? I think we're guilty of being it depends, and a bit consultative about that. And so that's our traditional approach, and that's worked well in the past. But sometimes, people just want to know how to do it. Like, how would you do it is often the question. And I think if I was to summarize in one sentence what enterprise scale landing zones are, it is, how do we do landing zones at scale in Azure? So this is our answer. This was released this financial year at Microsoft, so this July it was released, and it is embedded into the Cloud Adoption Framework as one of the landing zone options. Now, I would argue that it should be your default landing zone option. And why should it be your default? Well, because we've aligned the architecture and the roadmaps of all of our products with our best practice from engineering, and said, how should we do this? And this has been born of learning with our customers as well. Our customers, obviously, we have some enormous customers who use our platforms, and out of that has come a lot of good practice that we're now baking into this. Of course, as you'd expect, it contains a lot of Azure native components. And in fact, that's one of the design principles, because we feel that's how you get the best experience. But we also recognize that sometimes customers want or have to do things a different way, and that's fine. We can bake in customer requirements into this. As an example, you might not want to use Azure Firewall. You might have an existing contract with one of the other providers, right? And that's fine. You can use your own firewall, whatever. And there are different examples as we go on. So why would you adopt enterprise scale, I guess? Well, as harking back to those questions that Paul said, if you're struggling, you've made your first tentative steps into Azure and you've got some workloads there, and then it's like, well, we want to put another workload there. Where do we put it? How do we make sure that it can talk to everything else, but it's, we can do the billing properly, and we understand how the security isolation of that workload works? All of these questions, which people don't often consider up front, are considered as part of this, part of the design process for this. So ultimately, after you've gone through the initial 6 to 8 week period of getting this in with a partner or with Microsoft, then it will accelerate the adoption of workloads moving into the cloud. That's its goal, right? It's to do a lot of the stuff up front, so that you can, after that, say, right, this is how we do landing zones. Here's bang, here's a landing zone for this application. Bang, here's a landing zone for that application. it is based on policy. So there's a lot of Azure policy in this. And that's a good thing, because actually it's important to understand where enterprise scale starts and where enterprise scale stops. And we'll come on to some of the design principles in a minute. But actually, we go down as far as a subscription level on the landings. Each landing zone is in its own subscription. And after that, we don't really mind how an application owner decides to deploy their application. And the reason we don't mind is because we've done a lot of work in Azure policy to make sure that give them those guardrails, as we're calling them, right? So that you've got a box to play in, and we've put some governance around that. But within that box, you can kind of do what you like, right? As long as it doesn't breach our policy. And the reason that we can say that we don't mind what tools that you use, right? Is the application owner could use Terraform, the application owner could use whatever deployment method they want, Ansible, doesn't matter. We are building this governance using native tooling, and that's key. So although in the future, I think there will be implementations of enterprise scale landing zones in other tooling, this is our reference architecture, and it's built using native Azure tooling. Cool. The next
some great scene setting there, Matt. Just one thing to add, and I know we talked about this as well, is if an enterprise scale is all about applying policies to Azure and then adhering to those policies, I guess one of the out of band things that could happen is and questions that you may have is how do we control changes that happen in that way? So someone goes into the portal, makes a change to a policy that we haven't done through enterprise scale, and what we mean by that is you can have an automated way, a pipeline to kind of push these changes through. If when you push a change through, it will automatically detect any deviations that have happened, and then it will ask you what you want to do and say that there's a change being made that's outside of this scripting that you've put together for enterprise scale. How do you want to address that change? Do you want to accept it and then bake it into your enterprise scale, or do you want to push it out and remediate that?
Yeah, good shout. That's true. So I think it's worth taking stock of the design principles of enterprise scale. I believe there are 7. I want to say 7, but I'm going to let the slide build and then we'll know for sure.
Just going to, let me just fill this out for you, Matt. It did look a bit blank. I'm thinking I didn't reckon it when that slide.
Sorry, 5. Okay, 5 here. And this will kind of get you, hopefully, to understand some of the thinking behind enterprise scale and why we've kind of chosen this path. So yeah, if we those are the 5: subscription democratization, policy-driven governance, single control plane, application-centric and archetype neutral, which is extraordinarily jargonistic, but and Azure native design and platform roadmap alignment. Okay, so we're going to kind of zoom in or double click on each of those in turn, and we'll explain a bit about how this works. So before we had some of the tools we have now, generally having more subscriptions was discouraged because it added complexity. If you think back into the early days before we had VNet peering, right, you would have to have a virtual network gateways between virtual networks and VPN between them. So actually, the more subscriptions and more VNets you had, that became really hard to manage. So actually now we've got a load of tools in our kit bag that say actually this is pretty easy to do, right? Especially if you build some automation around it. So we say that you should be looking to democratize subscriptions, and what we mean by that is give them out to application owners. Now, we're not prescriptive about whether you have one single app in a subscription or 5 or 10, or we don't really mind. But what we're saying is that you should consider subscriptions to be things that you can give out and take away, and they should be created and destroyed as application life cycles dictate. And if you can see the diagram on the left-hand side there, you can see that around the outside of the subscription, there's a load of governance stuff, which is in the kind of darker blue shaded boxes. Thanks, Paul. So you'll see that's IAM, so identity access management, role assignments, role definitions, things like that. A set of policy, So you might not be able to do things like put public IP addresses on things. You might not be able to change the default routing tables so that all traffic gets sent back to your central NVA or firewall. There's a management and monitoring capability there. So any resource you deploy will automatically have its logs forwarded back to a central log analytics workspace. So back to Clive's presentation earlier, how about, excuse me, if all of your resources, whenever you deployed, let's say, a key vault, automatically the diagnostic logs, whether you selected that option or not, automatically the diagnostic logs get sent back to that log analytics workspace, and you automatically get that enriched data in there ready for your SOC team and ready for your, anyone who wants it, ready team to look at. You've also got cost management built in. And shared services, so you have access to typically a central hub network, whether that be through virtual WAN or hub and spoke networking. That will all be done for you, right? As an application owner, this is what you get. Now, that policy that you get will depend on what type of landing zone it is. So you might have a different set of policy for doing internet-facing workloads than you will for doing corporate applications, right? And that's cool. We can take into account of that, and we'll show you kind of how we manage that later. Cool. I think we're good on this. Azure policy has been set as the guardrails, as we're calling it. So that can be a simple block stuff, right? No, you're not allowed to do this. That's cool. Sometimes that's a really good thing, like public IP addresses. Stops people. You can also set it, for example, that if you deploy a storage account, you must use a private link. So you must only have that storage account available on an internal VNet, not the internet, which is great if you've got a corporate application, right? So you can do all that stuff. But you can also do some slightly kind of progressive and more clever stuff with policy. So as your policy, you can have an append mode and a deploy if not exist mode. And it's this that really brings the value, I think, of enterprise scale. So the deploy if not exist is perfect for those diagnostic settings. And simply we create a policy which says, if you deploy this type of resource and it doesn't have the diagnostic settings configured, like how they're supposed to be, then configure them and it will do it for you. Really, really great. We can kind of show you some examples of that later on. So yeah, let's move on. Now, this is our reference architecture, right? This is Microsoft's view of how things should be done. Now, as such, we are not advocating the use of any other tools apart from the Azure native tooling. And that's a deliberate decision. Okay, so when you have a look at this reference architecture, it's ARM templates, it's Azure policy. Okay, it's PowerShell is used to kind of drive the automation around it. If you choose to use the DevOps way of deploying this, okay, using GitHub Enterprise or Azure DevOps. So it's using our own native tooling, and that's deliberate. However, me being realistic, I think customers are already going to have investments in maybe Ansible. Terraform is extremely popular, especially if you're a multi-cloud customer, right? So there will be implementations of this in Terraform. So don't worry that you have to use this. So the value, as I say, is in the policies, and it's ultimately how you get those policies deployed into Azure is not that important. We've got a way of doing it, which is native tooling. If you want to use Terraform, that's cool, right? The important thing is that you've made that governance decision, you know how you're implementing those controls, and that you do so, right? So this one is my least favorite just because it's got a silly name. And what we mean by this is the landing zone shouldn't care what's in it, right? Now, obviously, there are going to be policy differences between different types of landing zones, but we're not building a landing zone just for lift and shift, right? We're not building a landing zone just for PaaS. We've seen customers in the past have completely separate subscriptions, one for IaaS and one for PaaS, and it doesn't really make sense to divide it up that way. So we're saying, look, we recognize it's an application-centric approach. When you move an application to Azure, you don't move 1,000 VMs, you move, I don't know, 200 applications, right? That's what you're moving. So really, this is what we're focused on. And that's reflected actually throughout all our guidance now. And I think most people consider that as well. But don't think this is just for VMs, because it's not, it's for containers, whatever you want, WVD, everything. And finally, yeah, so this, what we're saying is, because we're using Azure native services where you know, we use Azure Firewall, we use virtual WAN as our default, you're going to get the best experience in terms of our roadmap, because we're going to pick the best of breed for you. Now, of course, you can deviate from that, and that's absolutely fine. But the reference architecture that's deployable, and we'll show you that in a second, uses Azure native components, and it will always give you the best of what we can offer at any given time. Cool.
Do you want me to cover this one, Matt?
Go for it.
Give yourself a breather. So, who's enterprise scale for? I think one of the things that listening to or reading the name enterprise makes you think that that's for large customers, and I think that's rightly kind of maybe kind of a mistake that, you know, in terms of thinking that, because enterprise scale, whilst it sounds massive and, you know, for the large corporates, it can be for any size organization. And I think that's one thing I want you to take away. It's for everyone. And the reason we say that is because you don't start out, even if you're small, you shouldn't start out on your journey and go, I'm only going to do this. And just therefore, I know there's going to be a limit I'm going to hit, so I'll just do it quick and do it this way. Well, that's fine if you know, if you want to throw it, you know, you're going to throw it away. But what about if you're not and you need to grow and you don't know what the future looks like, but you know, if you embrace the cloud, you embrace Azure, then you're likely needing to kind of make sure that you've got those guardrails in place, that you do adhere to those limits that are in place, that you have, you know, there may be some compute limits that you hit in a subscription. You need multiple subscriptions to then overcome that. So you know, I guess start small. It's not necessarily a cost as such, that enterprise scale itself isn't necessarily a cost. It's the, you know, it's the wrapper policies around that. Yes, there are some costs as you put some mandatory policies in place, which may say we need you to spin up a log analytics, or we need you to put a V1 hub in for each subscription, etc., etc. You know, there'll be things like that. But I guess, you know, you can start small and still use the framework of enterprise scale. You don't necessarily have to take it all and apply it to your environment. But you should start to think about, you know, again, my messaging is to everybody is definitely look at this. Everybody should be looking at this as the future of how to look at deploying landing zones in Azure. But I guess there's one thing that me and Matt wanted to kind of call out as well, is don't rush from this presentation if you're midway through a large migration and go, halt everything. Paul and Matt said, we've got to do it properly before we go, because we don't want that to happen, right? That's not healthy, because that's going to introduce delays. And we don't want to instill that panic and fear into you. We just want to let you know that this is coming, this is out there. And you can look to bring this in later on. Obviously, you know, ideal earlier, you know, as early as possible. If you're greenfield and you're new to Azure, absolutely, that's a nice, clean and clear environment to work with. But if you're in flight and you need to get things moved, there are various drivers why you're going to be, you know, spinning up instances in Azure. It could be that you've got a DC data center closure, or a compelling event that needs you to get out. Hardware is end of life and you need to get out. The last thing you want to do is throw a spanner in the works and say, right, we need to start again and follow enterprise scale, because we can ultimately look to retrospectively fit this in where possible. That's not to say you're going to get the perfect if you did it greenfield, but you would certainly you'd certainly be able to bring in some of these things and apply them to your current environment. So yeah, I guess that's some message I want to make sure that we're clear on. Matt, do you want to cover this one?
Sure, yeah. As I mentioned, enterprise scale is Azure native stuff, right? So what you're looking at the moment is a management group hierarchy, and with some subscriptions under it. And this is the foundation that we currently offer for enterprise scale. And if I could just walk you through it, I will explain why we've made certain decisions. So if you're not familiar with management groups, if you are familiar with on-premises Active Directory, they're kind of analogous to organizational units. Why are they analogous? Well, they are a place, a management group is a place where you can define RBAC, and a place where you can define policy. Okay, and Alistair Sentinel goes in the management subscription with the log analytics there. Okay, so yeah, hopefully that answers that one. So if we think about management groups as a place where we can do policy and a place where we can do RBAC, then this is our best practice reference architecture. Now, this is a foundation. Yours will be for example, under landing zones, you will have different stuff under there, right? Now, but we recommend you always start with a organizational root under the tenant root group. Now, the reason we say that is so that you've got somewhere to go. Why not deploy all your policies at the top level? Why not do it all from there? Well, one, mergers and acquisitions. You might have another organization that's doing things differently to you that you need to bring in alongside this, right? So as a sibling of Contoso, you could have a different set of management groups. Also, if you're having real problems and you're not sure what your policy, if your policy might be affecting something, if you don't have a tenant root group with no policy assigned, then you can't move your subscription into there to test it, right? If it's a kind of break glass type of thing. So we have our Contoso, and we have all of our policy definitions are stored there. So anything that we want to be able to assign exists in Contoso. We then split out into platform and landing zones. So I'll come on to landing zones shortly, but platform, we always have three: management, connectivity, and identity. And underneath there, we have a single subscription in each. Management is the first subscription that you'll create and might in fact already exist. And that's where you put log analytics, security center, things like that. We advocate a shared log analytics workspace for everyone, especially now that we've got the resource-centric views on there, right? So that means that you don't have to have permission to absolutely everything to view log analytics, right? The connectivity subscription will, as you'd expect, contain express routes, virtual WAN, or your hubs for if you have a hub and spoke network. It will also contain perhaps a private DNS zone if you're using that. Now, typically your connectivity is managed by a different team, so there's an RBAC reason for separating this out. Finally, you have identity. If you have domain controllers in Azure, then they will live here. The reason that that's in a separate subscription is because if you're a subscription admin, then you can do all sorts of things to your subscription, like have access to everything, including the disks for the domain controllers. So the best practice is to split this out into a separate subscription and have your identity team be the admins of that, because they are the application owners for identity, right? For your Active Directory. Now, all of these networks that are in management and identity are peered to the hub in connectivity. The other things that are peered to connectivity are the landing zones. Now, at the moment, we have corp and online. So that's a very simple setup. We're doing this for a customer at the moment where that is considerably more complicated because they have 5 or 6 different business units, right? So they've all got underneath landing zone, there's each business unit. And they have done that because each business unit wants their own policy and RBAC, okay? There's actually another one, there's another sibling of landing zones and platform called Sandbox, which is where you do your slightly, you have a slightly less restrictive policy there. So it allows you to, evaluate new Azure resource types and things like that. So you can see there that we've got maybe a difference between corp and online because of public IP address, but you get the idea that hopefully you can have different policies at different levels. Cool. So now I've finished, Paul. Sorry.
That's fine. Thank you. And I guess, Matt, one of the kind of, talking about the policies at the top level and then why you'd split out and have, the difference between corp and online. And one thing, for this session, we thought would kind of bring it to life is in your corp world, if your internal data, your internal facing data, you wouldn't want to be having public IP addresses being able to be created to attach to that corp data. So one of those policies on that corp management group could be that you deny public IP address creation, and therefore, and obviously that policy wouldn't work for online, because obviously for online you'd need to be having public IP addresses to connect from the internet to those resources behind online. So there's a lot of rationale behind why you'd separate these out, but very effective and simple ways to kind of split those. And I think going back to the CAF session I ran, I think it was October last year now, some time ago. But when we talked about policies, that this is the reassurances that some of those who I spoke to are unable to kind of convey to their management teams and security teams. This is that next level of saying, okay, well, we talked about policies. Now we've got a framework to be able to roll this out now. So you can say, well, look, we talked about it. Now here it is in its form, and it's effectively from Microsoft direct. So it's a great source to kind of take forward. Okay, so enough of the slides now. I'm going to do a quick run through of what it looks like, and we can certainly take questions if need be. Maybe it's a good point if you've got questions, come off mute whilst I kind of come into my subscriptions. I'll take a pause. Any questions at this stage? Silence is good. We're doing a good job. Oh, yeah, you've covered that one, Matt. Matt, it might be worth just kind of replaying the question for the audio, because I know that when this is recorded and played back, you don't necessarily see the text in the video.
Okay,
so
I'll read it out.
You go for it.
John,
go for it.
John says, if VNets are in the landing zone subscription and you have domain controllers in the identity subscription, then what VNet would the DCs be on? And wouldn't you need a VNet in the identity sub? And you're absolutely right. And apologies if that wasn't clear from the diagram. Yes, there is a VNet in the identity sub. It is in effect a special landing zone. So it is a peered network to the hub, but it's just a special landing zone that has some additional controls around it because of the sensitive nature of domain controllers. And we recognize actually that you're going to have domain controllers in multiple regions, right? You're going to maybe have domain controllers in a couple of regions if you're a large organization.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. So I guess just going to run through a few things with you, how you get started. Now we've got links to this as well, so you can dive into this later on yourselves. But ultimately, there's a GitHub repository here, so you can see it's GitHub/Azure/enterprise scale. This is public, so anybody can get to this. So if you on the landing page, there's actually a deploy to Azure button right at the top. So nice and simple. There's also a whole raft of documentation to go through as well. Now, this documentation is actually part of CAF now. So a lot of this documentation here is now baked into the ready section of Cloud Adoption Framework, but it's also here as well, as this is where it was born in GitHub originally. So, okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just run through what a deployment looks like. I won't actually execute the deployment because I've done it, and then I'll show you what it looks like for mine. So if we click deploy, that's going to take me to Azure. I'm going to sign in as my deployment account. So effectively, we get a custom deployment come up. So we can pick our region. Now, one thing to call out is I'm doing this under my my detached subscription. So this isn't part of, so in Microsoft, we get our own subscriptions that are part of the Microsoft Azure AD. Now that limits us in what we can do at the Azure AD, naturally, because it's owned by Microsoft. So what I'm doing is using a separate MSDN subscription that we have, and I've created myself an Azure Active Directory domain, and then attached this subscription to that Azure Active Directory domain. So you can all do this relatively easy, and it will be documented through the steps to what you need to do. So I'm going to pick some parameters here.
So we just mentioned actually this process that Paul's doing now is the documentation for this is now public. Okay, it's called the inner box document, and we'll send the links out afterwards. So don't worry about following every step. This is all very clearly documented.
Perfect, thank you. So if we just pick a, where did I put mine? I think I put mine in North Europe. So if I pick, why can't I see? You can West Europe, North Europe, there, West Europe. I'm just going to pick. I'll pick UK South. I'm not actually going to execute this anyway. But so if I click next, so there's a management group prefix. So this is, I think it's 5 letters long. So you just need to put something in there. So enterprise scale, my initials PG, and then there's an enable management subscription. So what this does is if you've got an existing subscription, then you need to apply. If you put the GUID for that subscription in here, then that will effectively automatically move that to the relevant management group that we talked about in the previous slide that Matt walked through. So that will automatically move it from its current location into that management group, ready to start applying policies to that. So I'll drop mine in just for the sake of it. There's nothing sensitive about this. So you'd effectively just put this number in here and then click next. And then there's 3 different types here. So if I go back to the GitHub content, so we go back here. So I think it's further down. So there's 3 different flavors of deployment that we can do here. So there's a Contoso reference, and that comes with V1. So you can click on that there. Effectively, these buttons go to the same place, and that's where you'll see here. This is where it translates into which one you'll deploy. Then you've got the AdventureWorks, which is hub and spoke instead of V1 with on-premises connectivity. And then you've got Wingtip with Azure without any connectivity. So that's just the native Azure components in there. As you can see, the hub and spoke is end of this month, estimated to be available. So just for argument's sake, I'm going to click V1 and then click next, and then enable resource deployments. So if you see in here, it says if yes is selected, when also adding a subscription. So we added, you remember we added a subscription in the previous step. I dropped in the ID for that subscription. ARM will assign 2 policies that will deploy log analytics workspace and automation accounts to your management subscription, and then it will enable diagnostic logs of activity logs to be sent to that log analytics workspace. If no, it will be ignored. So basically what that's doing, it's setting up some policies for you when you initially set up enterprise scale. Otherwise it won't do anything. There won't be any policies assigned. But for the sake of this, I clicked yes. And then the final step is just to review that and then click create. Okay, so that's got all my information of what I wanted. That will take about 10 minutes at most. I think at this point, Matt, I think it's probably good to mention, because I think there may be a question about cost at this stage. What's this going to cost if we did this in our subscription? I think costs are minimal at this point.
If you choose Foundation, then yeah, absolutely. You get a log analytics workspace, but because there's nothing in it, it doesn't cost you anything, right? So,
yeah. Okay, so effectively click and create. If we go to one I did earlier, so if we look at the management groups, you'll see here PGES. So I did it the other way around actually, but it was my initials, enterprise scale. So this is the the management group that has been created for me. If I click in that, and just going back, by the way, let me go back to the management group. So this right-click me root, this will be in there from the default. That's the root that you cannot. That's ultimately at the top of the chain. You can't change that. That's there, and then this PGES will go underneath that, and then all other management groups, which you're now starting to see here, are underneath. So this is where we become more granular, as we saw. And then if we dig in, say, to the platform, then we've got the 3 that well, we went through all of them, but the connectivity, identity, and management. And then in management, we click in there. We can see my subscription has been moved into that management group as part of that deployment we did in the Azure portal. Okay, so if I click into the subscriptions and click in there, so if we go into the activity log and the diagnostic settings, so you remember when in my deployment, I go back a couple of steps, or here actually on this one, where the yes or no, it said it will deploy Log Analytics Workspace. You'll see here that it's deployed it, but it's also set up that all of these logs from this subscription will be sent to that Log Analytics Workspace. So I guess what this means is if you added another subscription under the same policy assignment, the same management group, it would receive exactly the same definitions requirements, which is if you're going to be created under my management jurisdiction, then I'm going to tell you that you send your logs to this Log Analytics. You don't have a say in that. I'm telling you this, and this is what this is doing. This is effectively forcing each subscription that's created to go to this Log Analytics. So I guess this is where you still retain control of your kind of core needs and requirements, security logs, etc. Diagnostic logs will all be sent to that central Log Analytics Workspace that we've defined as part of this subscription. Sorry, Matt, was there anything you wanted to cover at that point?
Just that, yeah, absolutely. This is the power. This is the reason it's good, right? It's because this policy is linked at the root level. So the EESPG or PGES, which is the equivalent of the Contoso in the diagram that I showed, right? And the point is that any subscription you now create underneath there automatically gets this, right? So whether you like it or not. So yeah, that's the reason it's good.
Okay, cool. And then if we go to, we had Log Analytics create here, didn't we? Let's have a look. The PG. So this effectively here you can see is the Log Analytics Workspace and the automation accounts. So those are what when you run this deployment, this checkbox here automates the deployment of these two, this Log Analytics Workspace here, and then so that's all set up for you there.
And this is all done through Azure policies, done through something called deploy if not exist. So yeah, just native Azure tooling.
So finally, it's going to go to the policy definition. So and show you what you get, what happens when you go into this. So if I go to the definitions here, what you'll see is when I change this to custom. So custom, all of these here are all new policies that are outside of the kind of core policies that you receive from the Azure native, the Azure, from out of the box. These are additional policies that are enterprise scale has injected into your environment. So you can see there's a whole raft of different policies here that you can apply, and this doesn't stop here as well. I guess this is just a flavor of policies, but there are also more that you can take. So there's a GitHub Azure policies repo where you can take examples and you can apply them here as well, and then you can assign them. So you've got two policies here assigned in the management group there, and then obviously compliance as well. Are we compliant? So I've got compliance here. The deploy analytics is compliant. We've got a tick box here. Good to go. Okay. I think I'm done, Matt. I don't think there's anything else I was going to cover.
Can I just point out one more thing?
Yeah, of course you can.
Cool. So at the moment, when you deploy the foundation, you get two policy assignments. The first is to deploy the Log Analytics Workspace itself, and the second is to force their. Now we are just about to improve this default offering. So actually, what you'll get that's coming soon is you'll get Azure Security Center enabled in all subscriptions, and you'll get another policy initiative, which is a collection of policies all grouped together for about 49 different resource types, I think, or 50 different resource types. You saw the policies there; they already exist, but we're going to assign that by default now, right? So essentially, it's a kind of one click. You're ready to go. You've got all these policy assignments. You've immediately got that extra governance in place right from the get-go. So, and because these are just native Azure policies, they're really easy to deploy into an existing, right? If you have already got some Azure and you've already got some management groups, or you're already doing some stuff, you can just take these policy definitions and use them. So you don't have to start from scratch.
Super. Okay, back to the slides. So I guess we talked about links. So this isn't really for you to kind of consume all these links. We'll share these slides with you so you have these available. But I guess so you've got the enterprise scale documentation. So that's the overview. And then the GitHub repo I just showed you, where you can click the deploy button. That's there as well, aka .ms enterprise scale. I think one of the things, I've certainly been on a journey. I expect that a lot of people will go on a journey around DevOps and using GitHub. There's various ways, as Matt's talked about, how you can deploy this. But if you get into the pipeline, you'll see in the in a box documentation, there's ways to connect it to a GitHub repo of your own, and then you can start applying policies automatically, and then doing that out of band change recognition and merging those changes, etc. You'll start to get a feel for that. It is a journey. So what we recognise is that there's some learning there. So we've put some links in. That's not going to get you covered everything on this. It's experience that's going to get you kind of skilled up on this, time and effort and experience invested in using that in the box documentation. And you'll see there in the the fourth main bullet point down, the enterprise scale in a box deployment guidance. So that's just been released. So internally at Microsoft, we've had that for a few weeks, and we've been scouring that and applying, providing feedback to the engineering team on flow of that documentation. So great that that's kind of been taken into account, and we've obviously released that out now to be consumed. So anybody can go to those links and just start trying this out. I guess what's coming, so kind of a bit of a roadmap. Now this is early in days, right? So, but there's a link here which kind of talks about feedback that we, you know, that how this works, so how we need the community to support. So if you're familiar with GitHub, and you can provide pull requests, or you can raise issues in GitHub. That's where the enterprise scale repo is. Then the team are listening, and they will adopt that if they feel it's relevant to the kind of steering of the future of enterprise scale. And what that means is if you are successful in a recognition of a request, then that will, or an issue or a feature, that will then get pulled into this milestone, and then you'll start to see when that's going to be planned to be released. So there's some useful links there for you on that. And I kind of jumped ahead on that, but this, I guess, the feedback. How do you feedback on enterprise scale? So now we're going to let you unleashed with that. Then pull requests and issues raised in GitHub is the way to go. And obviously, you saw Matt and my name. You're welcome to reach out to us LinkedIn or Twitter or the user group forum to ask any questions, or raise them directly on GitHub with the engineering team. That is all I think we've got to cover. I'm conscious of time. I think we're just about over. But Matt, was there any final words? Yeah, any final words from you?
No. Thanks for listening. Hope you've enjoyed it. Get in touch if you want to know more.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul and Matt.
Thank you.
I think you're near enough finished bang on time, or maybe with even 2 minutes to spare.
Well, maybe that's the questions.
Yeah. Is there any questions from those of us that are left? Don't all rush at once. Great. Okay. Well, I've already got a post ready. I've already managed to upload the video from the first session. So as soon as this one appears on stream, I'll upload this, and I'll get them up on YouTube and then post it on the Midlands Azure user group and publicly as well. But thank you everyone that's spared the time this evening to come along, listen to Paul and Matt and Clive earlier, and I wish you well for the rest of the evening and for the rest of the week. Thanks very much.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.